Welcome to the Frank Farmer Loomis Show. I'm Frank Farmer Loomis, and I am delighted to be your host. You know, for centuries now, Cincinnati has been called the Queen City of the West, and it certainly is. This show is going to explore all the different aspects, all the jewels in the crown of the Queen City. Great architecture, great paintings, you name it, we're going to start. And one of the great jewels in Cincinnati is the Suspension Bridge, which I always want to call the Roebling Bridge. And our special guest today is Mr. Don Talisman Holzman, and he is the author of numerous books. I got to read my notes here to make sure. But I guess your proudest accomplishment, Don, is you're the curator of the German-American collection and the director of Germanic Studies at UC?
Well, yes, I was for many years, and I recently retired. And
but you're busier now than ever.
I'm busier now than ever, and I'm curator of the German Heritage Museum, and I'm speaking, giving lectures, and teaching, and writing books, and as busy as ever.
Well, I'm delighted to have you here because Don wrote a book about Suspension Bridge, right?
It's entitled John Roebling and His Suspension Bridge on the Ohio River, and it really tells the story not only of the bridge, but what I tried to do in the book was explain the personality of John Roebling and who he was and what he was like, what his personality was. And my feeling was to understand the creation, you have to understand the creator. So it's about the bridge, but it's more of an in-depth look at
the man.
At the man and his personality and what made him tick.
And we have a photograph for everybody to see here of Mr. Roebling. Tell us a little bit about his life. He was born in Germany?
He was born in Germany in a town called Mühlhausen, which is a medieval city with a ringed wall around. It goes back to about the 10th century. Played an important role in the Reformation. Johann Sebastian Bach was an organist there. He grew up in the old part of town, and he was surrounded by medieval churches and loved the Romanesque and Gothic architecture.
What year was he born, Don?
He was born in 1806, and this was right during the Napoleonic era. So by the time he was 9, was the end of the Napoleonic Wars. So he grew up in a very turbulent time, and early on his parents recognized that he was very gifted and intelligent and very much interested in architecture, art, and engineering. So they sent him to Berlin, where he studied architecture and engineering at the Royal Polytechnical Institute, which is really, even today, one of the major technical schools in Germany.
Still in existence.
Still in existence.
That is so cool. That's so cool.
And what was so interesting about him is that he studied, of course, engineering, focusing on bridge building, but he also was very interested in architecture. And this is really evident in all the bridges that he built. But at the same time, he was very interested in philosophy and theology, and he attended the lectures of Hegel, the great German philosopher who's well known for the Hegelian dialectic.
So he was a true Renaissance man.
True Renaissance man, and it was Hegel who first spoke about America and said that the future of humanity was in the West, in the New World. And that, I think, really first planted the seed in Roebling's mind about coming to America. And so he continued his studies. He wrote his dissertation on bridge building. And then by the end of the 1820s, many more people were starting to immigrate to America. There were a lot of books being written about America. And after the Napoleonic era, many of the monarchies had been reestablished.
Yeah.
It was the old order that had
the restoration in France.
The restoration
Yeah.
of the old order. And at the same time, in 1830 in July in France, in Paris, there was a revolution. And so people were thinking about throwing off these princes and kings and so on. And at that time, the immigration really started to grow. And people had two options. They could engage in revolutionary activities, and there were many in Germany in 1830 through 32. Roebling was one of those persons that took the option of immigration rather than revolution. Many people wanted to come to America, and he took the recommendation of Hegel to mind to come to America. So he and his brother started what was called the Millhausen Immigration Society.
Oh,
and they came to America, they landed in Pennsylvania, and they found a location just north of Pittsburgh called in Butler County. And they decided that they wanted to have a settlement there. And so a lot of people don't know his background. They think that he came here, he had studied engineering, he wanted to become an engineer here, but that wasn't true. They came here really to found a new settlement and to enjoy the freedoms of the new world here. And they set up a settlement there called Saxonburg near Pittsburgh.
Well, he did it spectacularly. And the next picture we have is the his bridge. I always want to call it the Roebling Bridge, and I'm supposed to call it the Suspension Bridge, right? Well, how did he come to Cincinnati, and what happened there with all of that?
Well, after he got settled in Pennsylvania in 1831, he then started producing wire rope, and he had a factory in 1841. And after that, then he started producing cables that consisted of these wire ropes. And up until that time, bridges that were suspension bridges were built out of hemp and rope and chain link.
So this is real high tech, goes in hand with the Industrial Revolution and everything.
Really, it was a product of the Industrial Revolution. And of course, these other bridges, they would break down if they were constructed with chain link or hemp.
And they wanted to get, they burned too.
Right, they would burn.
We won't go there.
So he started producing aqueducts and suspension bridges. Well, in 1846, he was invited to come to the Cincinnati Covington area because this went way back to the early 1810s. People on both sides of the river felt we have to get connected for business and commerce and trade. And some of the strongest proponents for a bridge were in Lexington, Kentucky. They wanted to connect and get their goods and so on, tobacco, across the river. And so they contracted with him to come here and put together a study of putting together a bridge across the river. So he did that in 1846.
Well, it was a long time in the making, wasn't it?
It was a long time in the making because the state of Kentucky right away approved a contract to build the bridge. The state of Ohio was very reluctant. It took them a couple more years before they approved a contract and constitution for the Covington Cincinnati Bridge Company. And the reason why Ohio took so long to approve this was because all the businessmen in Cincinnati got together and they influenced the legislators to attach a rider to this bill that said that no street in Cincinnati could align with the bridge. And the reason was the businessmen in Cincinnati were afraid that all of their business would flow across the river. So even today, when you're going across the bridge into Cincinnati, you see it doesn't go straight up into Walnut Street or Vine Street.
I learned that last year.
You have to bend, and that goes back to this bill. And so there was a lot of squabbling amongst businessmen and about that to just approve the charter.
Sounds like today, in many ways.
For the bridge.
Yeah.
And so that was in 1846, but then a problem then in getting the bridge going was finances. It took another 10 years to raise the money to build it. So Roebling actually didn't get back here until 1856 to start work on the bridge.
Kind of a, well, when you're talking about this, I have to put it in perspective. Abraham Lincoln was born in 1809, so they were contemporaries.
Exactly, they were contemporaries.
This is all goes on with history of Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War. So he's here about 5 years before the Civil War, and what happens?
Well, they started construction in 1856, and then in 1857 there was a huge financial panic that sounds much like things that have happened here recently. A lot of businesses were failing. The currency value was going down. Many people were out of work, so construction was really ground to a halt, and very little was being done. And from that point on, from about 1857 up until 1863, little or no work was done. 2 towers were put in place. They were built and put into place, and but no work could continue. But what really got work going was the siege of Kentucky in 1862 in September. Earlier that summer, too, John Hunt Morgan
Oh, yeah.
had threatened the area, but it was really the siege of Kentucky when Confederate troops really got within earshot of the area. They were really around the 275 area in northern Kentucky.
And in those days, Don, was there like a pontoon bridge to get across, or
Well,
wasn't even that?
at that time when the area was threatened, all of the troops from the area were in the Union Army or on the Eastern Front. And so the governor of Ohio issued a call to troops, call to arms. General Lew Wallace was placed in command of the area. And so thousands of troops flocked to the area. They were called the Squirrel Hunters. Also, about a dozen regiments, federal troops, were sent to the area, but there was no way to get across the river. And so they took barges, latched them together side by side, then over the barges put planks of wood so they can construct this bridge. Now, it brought altogether about 50,000 troops to northern Kentucky and protected the area, but it really brought to mind to the area that they had to complete that bridge, not only for business and commercial reasons, but for military reasons.
That's a good point.
To protect the area, because if this area was really a prime plum in the eyes of the Confederate Army, and if they would have captured this area, it really would have been a major victory for the Confederacy.
And they were in fear of that, weren't they, people in Cincinnati?
They were really in fear of it because but the troops were gone on the Eastern Front. There were a lot of munitions and industry here in the area.
Big important center, wasn't it?
Yeah, so it would have been a tremendous thing. And so when it was decided to then get the bridge going back again under construction, Roebling came back to the area. In the meantime, he was all over the country working on other projects. You have to keep in mind, he was like a juggler with many balls in the area. He had many projects.
And he was a perfectionist, you said.
He was a perfectionist, and he was...
Well, we're not complaining.
He was going morning, noon, and night. He worked from dawn till dusk. He was, 7 days a week. He was working constantly. So when he came back here, he started work on the bridge in 1863. Kept working on the bridge. They got the cables strung.
Can I ask you about that? Because I'm a little slow on these things. So they had the two towers that looked very Romanesque, like you had told me earlier, looked like his childhood in Germany?
Yes, the two towers he built were built under the influence of the Romanesque style of architecture.
Medieval
and that's
looking
one
style.
thing interesting about Roebling, that he didn't build bridges that were, strictly speaking, utilitarian. They were works of art.
Well, it was the Victorian era.
Yeah.
And yeah, that makes sense.
There were works of art.
Yeah.
And what was unique about his bridge was that it was a suspension bridge. So there were only two towers built on both sides of the shore, and then huge cables were strung across these towers. And each cable was about this thick and consisted of about 5,000 wires.
Oh my gosh.
That he had produced. And that was what gave strength to these cables, were all of these wires. And then these cables were strung, and then on the shoreline were anchored in anchorages on the shoreline. And then hanging from the cables would be suspender cables, and then from that would be the bed of the bridge would be hung from that. And the beauty of that kind of a bridge was that even though one of the cables or the suspenders could snap, the bed of the bridge could sway, but it would not fall or collapse into the river. And it was completely different than a truss style of bridge that was built upon many towers. And the problem of that kind of bridge, which is still true today, if one of these towers collapses, the whole bridge will collapse like a deck of cards. Whereas with a suspension bridge, you only need two towers rather than many towers. And there's a strength in that kind of a bridge. And also, it was perfectly designed for the Ohio River because you needed that space under the bridge for the steamboats to pass under.
And with the I want to say Clyde because I had the smokestacks.
With smokestacks.
Oh, wait till you, I got a surprise for you as we go. Don, I have another picture here that you're looking at the computer and the folks at home can see it on the screen. It says the Roebling Bridge there, 1867. So in other words, would they be saying on that sign, finally finished or something like that?
Finally finished, because when you think about it, Roebling came here in 1846, work began in 1856, and then it resumed in 63, but it wasn't completed until December 1866, December 1st, and that's when pedestrians could first walk across the bridge, but it wasn't until January 1st, New Year's Day, 1867, it was officially dedicated. So there was really from December 1st to 66 to January 67, they had this month-long kind of a celebration and of the bridge and dedicating it.
I bet they probably said Louis built Versailles quicker than the I want to call it the Roebling Bridge, but the Suspension Bridge. Then I have another old postcard here for you. Once it opened up, how did it affect the whole area?
It had a tremendous impact on the area business-wise and commercially, and also to northern Kentucky, because when people started settling and coming down the river, and first of all, when people, this was the main artery of transportation, steamboats coming up and down the river, and people would always say once they saw the bridge, they knew they were in Cincinnati. It became the major landmark, but people then started to settle throughout northern Kentucky, and it really began to bind the region together in a way it hadn't been before, and it really became the greater Cincinnati area.
That's good. And the later thing would be like what 275 did to all the suburbs, connecting it together and everything.
Exactly.
And really, another couple of pictures here I have for you, Don, show the how Cincinnati looked in the old days and everything like that, and it didn't have the Fort Washington Way or any of those things, did it?
It looked quite a bit different then, and also the bridge looked quite a bit different then, because the towers then were on the shoreline. They were on dry land.
Oh my God, that's a brilliant point. Yeah.
And people always ask about that because they were it was on dry land, and they wondered about that, and they said, have asked, did they have to build caissons like for the Brooklyn Bridge? Well, they didn't, because the towers were built on the shoreline. But then later on, there were dams built further up the Ohio River, and that the river rose, and so now the towers are in the Ohio River. But originally, when the bridge was built, the Ohio River was only about 10 feet deep, and sometimes when it was very dry, it was said you could even walk across.
I don't think any of us realized
no,
that.
You could walk across the river. So it's totally changed since the river has been dammed up, and the shoreline and the towers are now in the river, but actually it was quite a bit different originally.
Well, I love how you point out it is a work of art, and it is part of the Industrial Revolution like Finley, and it certainly is one of the major jewels, maybe the center jewel in Cincinnati, and people come from all over the world to see it and everything.
Well, they really do, and Roebling himself loved this bridge best of all. This was his favorite bridge,
well,
and then at that time, of course, they didn't call it the Roebling, it was called the Ohio Bridge, and then later on it became known as the Suspension Bridge, but its official name is the John A. Roebling Suspension Bridge.
We like that name better.
And it's the only bridge that carries his name. And today now, there are only 2 bridges in existence remaining that he built. This one and the Brooklyn Bridge, which is patterned on this bridge. There's also an aqueduct that he built in Pennsylvania.
Well,
but this is really a national,
yeah.
It's not only a regional landmark, it's a national landmark.
Yeah, and we got a picture of the Brooklyn Bridge, and I'm trying to take the high road, everybody, but I really get, what's the word, Don? You have the same thing. Frustrated that our bridge isn't, that the Brooklyn Bridge gets all the credit. This bridge is what, like the gliders were at Kitty Hawk to the Wright brothers. This is the trailblazer, isn't it? And why don't we get more about it?
Well, I think that's really true because, it's funny, even people from New York come here and they're surprised when they see the Suspension Bridge, and then I've explained to many New Yorkers, well, yes, your bridge is patterned after this one. And they're completely surprised that they've never heard of this bridge. And so I think maybe more should be done to publicize the bridge and the fact that it was the model. I think people here in the area are pretty much aware of that, but in New York, they're not.
Well, yeah, and just amazing, 1867 that bridge was finished here. And I got another picture for you here I'm going to show you. I'm just going to scoot down here. And then the last picture, don't you look at yet, Don. I want you to see this one. This inspired many famous bridges, didn't it?
Well, it did. It inspired, the bridge here inspired a lot of bridges around the world that were built as suspension bridges. And one of the, it's interesting, another Cincinnatian who was a man by the name of Joseph Strauss. He was born here. He's a son of German immigrants. Had a lot in common. He was very interested in Roebling as a person, and he studied engineering at the University of Cincinnati. And he was kind of a short fellow, not very tall, and he wanted to go into sports, play football, but he couldn't. So he really got into engineering, very much interested in bridge building. And it said that one of the things that he loved to do was to come down to the banks of the Ohio River and just stand and sit there and study the bridge. And so he always wanted to become a bridge builder.
Not the Brooklyn Bridge, but the John A. Roebling.
The John A. Roebling Bridge. And so then he went on to build the Golden Gate Bridge, a suspension bridge, which is patterned, of course, it's the model of the suspension bridge. And when he built that in the 1930s, he contracted with the John A. Roebling company in New Jersey. The company existed many years, up until after World War II, that was founded by Roebling. So they got all of their cable and wire from the Roebling company to build the Golden Gate Bridge.
That's like 60 years later, or 65. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a high-tech version, isn't it? It's very streamlined looking. It doesn't have any arches or anything like that.
It's very, very streamlined. And also, another thing that happened to the bridge here, the Roebling Bridge, was in the 1890s, trusses were added to it to strengthen the bridge so it wouldn't sway, because there were new kinds of traffic making use of the bridge, electric streetcars. Oh. And when Roebling built the bridge, there weren't things like electric streetcars, so they had to put trusses on it. So the Golden Gate Bridge, too, has steel trusses on it, and to strengthen the bridge. And another example is the Mackinac Island Bridge, which is this real long suspension bridge. So many people are really studying, even today, the suspension bridge, because some time ago there was a collapse of a bridge in Minnesota, which was the standard truss bridge built on towers, and people at that time then became very interested again in the suspension bridge. And a point to keep in mind is that many bridges have been built on the Ohio River since World War II and have been replaced and torn down. The Brent Spence Bridge has to be replaced. It was built in 1963 and has to be replaced, whereas when you think about the Roebling Bridge, built in 1867 and is still extant and in place.
Doesn't surprise me. That's why I like antiques. They last forever. And when we were getting ready for this show, you were telling me two things that I think would be fun to bring up today. Number one was that the bridge originally was a toll bridge. Is that right?
Yes. Well, the bridge was built by a private company, the Covington and Cincinnati Suspension Bridge Company. And so you did have to pay a toll to get across the bridge, and up until 1953, when it was sold to...
Don't you look, this is my surprise for you.
But you had to pay 10 cents for a vehicle to go across the bridge and 5 cents if you were a pedestrian. And I believe that was really in place up until 1963.
Was that to pick up the horse droppings and everything?
Yeah, among other things.
Some things are better now, aren't they? Yeah.
But then the Brent Spence opened, and when that opened, then the toll booths were taken down. You didn't have to pay a toll. But even today now they're debating should there be tolls for the new Brent Spence Bridge. And you said this is what was in place. And when a lot of people, when they went back and forth as pedestrians, they would get long rolls of tickets. So you could buy, say, a roll of 50 tickets when you went back and forth across the bridge.
And then you were talking, what happened in 1937 in this area, which is a real credit to Mr. Roebling?
Well, there was this great flood in 1937, and all of the bridges along the Ohio River, except the Roebling Bridge, were not usable. They were covered up, or they were swept away by the flood. They were covered, but the only bridge that was still in operation was the Roebling Suspension Bridge, and this was it meant it was really a lifeline for all of northern Kentucky, southern Indiana, and for southern Ohio, because for groceries, for example, the only way groceries could be brought, for example, from across the bridge to Louisville, it had to go over this bridge. Fire trucks, emergency vehicles, ambulances, they all depended on that single bridge for, I mean, as far away as Louisville and all the way to eastern Kentucky and all throughout the region. It's remarkable, and that the bridge kept in operation. The whole area really depended on it.
And was there a movement always to preserve this beautiful landmark? There was never any rumors to...
No, there were...
Yeah, never any...
No,
even in the 50s and the 1960s and everything like that.
No, there was always, and really the movement really to preserve it really came about in 1976 during the American Bicentennial. People got together and they formed the Covington Cincinnati Suspension Bridge Committee, which exists today. And what they did in 1976 was to adorn it with lights on the bridge. So it now has lights on it. And you know, I've heard just recently that other suspension bridges are following suit and also lighting up their bridges.
It seems like something they should have done all along. I have a surprise for you. Look at the screen here, and everybody at home can see this. I was appraising this painting. It's a 1956 painting by Howard Bauer, a local artist, of the Roebling Bridge with the steam, see, and the steamboat there. And when I looked at I said to my client, I said, oh, that's the Roebling Bridge. And he said, no, it's a suspension bridge. And I said, oh yeah, you're right. What do you think of that painting from and there's the steamboat, like you said, going underneath, because you said it had to be high enough for the smokestacks, right? Right, so
that was probably done sometime depicting a time period in the later 19th century, because
this was done in 56.
Oh, it was done in 56.
But maybe he was depicting a late 19th century.
Yeah, because the steamboat there could come between the tower and the shoreline. Well, so, and again, it gives you an idea of how much the river has risen.
I think you like that painting, huh?
Very much. It's a beautiful painting.
That was my surprise for you. I can't believe it. We'd like to thank Don Heinrich Tolzmann, author of numerous books, including German Cincinnati and Mr. Roebling's Bridge. Don, learned so much from you today. Thank you for being on the show. And I want to thank my friends here at Anderson TV, Shane Reinhardt, Jeremy Lloyd, Beverly Schneider, and of course, Ms. Nikki Bishop for all her help. We will be doing more shows, more highlights of all the great artistic heritage here in the Queen City. The list is endless, so thank you for listening today.